Hello and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to be joined today by Mike Gifford. Mike is responsible for the accessibility at Drupal, working on the Drupal 8 core. Is that correct, Mike? Have I got my details muddled, or is that more or less correct?
That's more or less correct. There's two maintainers and at the moment for Drupal 8, and I'm one of them, and have been spearheading the accessibility initiatives in Drupal for about the last decade.
Yeah, I was aware that you've been there for a long time. We all seem to age in place in accessibility, right? We put down roots. So, how did you first come to sort of work in the accessibility field, and so tell us a little bit about what drew you to work in this field, and what drew you to work also for Drupal, and in terms of it's really important, I think, platforms that are hosting websites and CMS. It's sort of a neglected area. So how did you come to work in this area of accessibility?
Well, it's about 3% of the internet at the moment, so or of the web. So it is a reasonably large chunk of the internet. It's really not as big as WordPress, but I guess I started my business in '99, back before content management systems were a thing, and back in 2001. I set up my own content management system, but then it became a difficult thing to try and set up and maintain. So it was an open source tool, and I learned a lot through the process of developing it, but just couldn't keep up with the rate of change that I saw in the Drupal community, and decided to go off and to move from my own CMS that was particularly dealing with multilingual websites, and moved to Drupal, which was hopefully going to be addressing that or making that easier in a reasonable period of time. And so back around 2005, 2006, I went off and made a transition to just starting to move my clients over to Drupal. Now I've been involved in open source projects and trying to go off and aware of open source as a philosophy of a way of doing things and collaborating together for quite a while, and it was so that was sort of one side of how I got into Drupal. I got into accessibility before that. I was just through a number of friends who sort of introduced me to disability rights and learning about how other people go off and interact with the world. So I was certainly sensitized to that, but hadn't really done anything to sort of learn about how to go off and to bring that into my web practice until about 2008, when I was looking at how to transition my business, and what I looked at ways to go off and make some simple improvements in Drupal that would make it more accessible. And I figured, it's already a standards driven community. It shouldn't be that hard to go off and to fix a couple accessibility issues, and then go and make something that is accessible. And little did I know that 10 years later we're still just sort of there's so much more to do, and we're at the tip of the iceberg of how to go off and to in many ways go off and address the accessibility of the platform that we're building. No, it's so much better than anything else, but it's also something that we know how many problems there are and how much work there needs to be done to go off and actually build something that is inclusive by default. And so it's an interesting challenge trying to go off and to work with this community to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that I use CMS myself, and I'm aware of, obviously, working in the industry that I do, of the need to make sure that the sites that I'm maintaining are accessible. But a lot of people aren't, and so but the workflow of putting content up onto onto a website is a really crucial part of maintaining accessibility. You can build an accessible website and then watch its accessibility degrade over time as you hand over the control of that website to the marketing team or the interns and the graduates to fill it with beautiful, inaccessible content. So what's your approach to sort of maintaining awareness for the people that are using your CMS? How do you keep accessibility front of mind for those users?
Well, there's I guess a lot of it comes down to some initial opportunities we had about making Drupal making Drupal 7 more accessible, and I was able to hire an incredibly bright blind developer for a summer to work on exclusively on Drupal accessibility, and Everett Zufeld, while he was working with me, was able to go off and make a great many contributions to the Drupal community, but also to sensitize the need to go off and to make the accessibility goals not just about front-facing information. We wanted to go off and make the back end accessible, and make sure that a blind user or somebody with any other disability could not only view the content but also edit it, administer it, and develop with it, and make sure that we're eliminating barriers throughout the interface. So we did that with Drupal 7, and then when we were starting to work with Drupal 8 and ATAG 2.0 had been released, we started to go off and to look at that, and we'd already addressed most of ATAG 2.0 Part A for the requirements, because we've already been looking at how to go off and make sure the back end is accessible. Again, not that it's perfectly accessible, not that it meets all of the criteria, but we built in a lot of structures into the back end to make sure that part A, so that the part focusing on making the authoring experience accessible, was already done and taken care of. So we didn't have to do that much work in that. I mean, there's still more to be done, but most of the work that needed to be done on ATAG was looking at part B, which is really the most interesting part of ATAG. It's a part of how do we make the CMS be something that actually helps authors produce more accessible content. So one of the pieces we did for this was just making the need to create alt text required by default, and to do that across the board. So that, I mean, alt text is one of the low-hanging fruits of accessibility. It's a no-brainer. But as far as you know, we're still the only CMS out there that has a requirement in the initial defaults, so that if you're uploading an image through a WYSIWYG editor or through the elsewhere within the interface, that the default is that you need to have alt text. And you can override that both programmatically or as a user, because there's sometimes when it's not appropriate to go off and to have alt text. But even just having that ability to go off and to force users to when they're adding content to make it just that much more difficult to do the wrong thing, and make doing the right thing just seem, well, just part of the workflow, right? As opposed to something like, oh, we'll add the alt text later if somebody notices. Like it's you're going to get a warning, you're going to get blocked by the system if you try and do that. And so, just to break that system down, and we've added a bunch of other things like making sure that you can create accessible tables, and that we have that set up so that when you're creating a view of tables that you have the option to create the caption and summary, and that information is there. We've added spell check so that there's the ability to go off and to make sure that your content, as you're creating the content, by default you're spell checking your content, and so that you're not producing typos, which again, as a screen reader is can't be expected to properly pronounce a misspelled word, right? So trying to add that level of discussion there.
So because some of our audience is less familiar with some of the acronyms. ATAG is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. So this is it's the less well-known but equally important sister piece of guidelines from the W3C, which is focused on the tools that we use to deliver stuff on the web as opposed to the content, which most people are familiar with the web content accessibility guidelines, but a tag is equally important. And I just thought I'd just clarify that for our audience who are not necessarily all quite so technical. So, but it's a really very important part of the infrastructure of an accessible and inclusive web. And I know Antonio's got a question, so I'm going to hand over to him.
Thank you, Neil. No, Mike. No, I know that you work with a lot of organizations, in the public and also in the private sector. Some of them, they drive and they relate with. They have millions of users visiting their websites
Right.
every day. It's basically something at scale. But sometimes people still struggle to understand, accessibility. Why? Based on your experience and the feedback that you get from the organizations you work with, can you tell us a little, what is the ROI behind creating an accessible website for them? Is it just you follow a checklist and it's done? Can you give us a little bit of an insight, or you can even say, does really ROI make sense, or we need to find another way of explaining it and take the value from it?
So, it's always interesting to try and figure out what is the motivator for our clients, and part of it comes down to legislation. So, in Ontario, there's the AODA that is a certain legislation that the Ontarians with Disability Act. We also have in the federal government in Canada, there's legislation to try and make sure that all of the public-facing websites and content meet WCAG 2.0 AA after the Donna Jotan case, where a blind woman was not able to go off and apply for a job that she was qualified for, and that she met problems with the job board in the hiring process, and sued the government successfully, not for money. She wasn't looking for financial contributions. What she wanted was to be able to see a change in government policies and practices. So that was a very bold decision for her to go off and to do that, and it was in many ways quite successful. So those are sort of two reasons that people come to us for accessibility. So the main is tied to legislation and policy of governments in Canada, or for that matter, the fear of lawsuits in the United States. So we get people who come for us for that reason as well. But I think that's a really fear is not a great motivator, and I would love to go off and have people sort of understand more about how they're benefiting, or how the rest of our society is impacted, and how many people are touched by accessibility. And if you look at the permanent, the temporary, the situational disabilities, it's quite a large number of the portion of the population. All you need to do is try and go off and see your website up on a screen that doesn't if it's being presented on you push it over onto a screen like me for an LCD projector, to see how if you don't have a sufficiently dark room, it's very difficult to see gray text, and that's something that affects a lot of people, regardless of how good their eyesight is. It's just the projector isn't good enough for a lighted room some of the time. And that's so common in conferences that what people are expecting from their desktop is very different from what the real world situation is. So I think I do want to go off and do more to try and think about the cultural reasons and the cultural values of organizations looking to embrace inclusion as part of how they do work. Not only because the baby boomers, in the Western civilization, the baby boomers are the biggest driver of economic decision making and political power in most of the Western world, and they're all losing their vision. They're all having mobility issues. They're all issues with suddenly having difficulty navigating websites, or the problems of aging of that population is really really important, and not that they necessarily consider aging as being an accessibility issue. I think that there still is a lot of stigma around accessibility and within that population, but that's really what it is, and it's increasing accessibility problems with age, and this is a population that's really never been denied anything, and to have a, I don't think that the senior executives in their position in on boards of directors or as shareholders are going to be satisfied with a having not being able to have access to the digital tools that they have grown to embrace and depend on.
If you look back to the beginning of your career, and you somehow revisit that period of time, and then you come back today, how far have we been in terms of accessibility? Are we in a better situation today, or we are still answering the same questions than, let's say, 10 years ago?
I think that there's been so much great work on training and on education that's available, and there's so many more good resources and a stronger community now than there ever has been before. The problem is that the web moves so quickly that just any technology in the internet is moving at such a fast pace that there's really very little opportunity for accessibility to catch up. It is as long as we're going off and tacking on accessibility at the end of the process, then it's going to be something that is an afterthought that is going to disappoint people. And you can look at what's happened recently with the Gutenberg project and WordPress, and how the accessibility team within WordPress was very frustrated with the lack to make sure that accessibility was being properly considered, and that there was going to be to make sure that the new release of the interface isn't less accessible than the current release. I think they're meeting a lot of friction within the developers on it, because there's so much work that needs to be done to rebuild their backend with to be accessible using React, and so I think that the more we can focus on getting people to bring in accessibility and open source together and find ways to fund that, the better we're going to be. Like there's right now a fairly large accessibility industry. You go to CSUN or M-Enabling, and you can see some organizations who have done quite well by going off and providing accommodation for people with disabilities, and that's great. That needs to happen, but if you look at the effort to try and fix the problems at the source, who are the people who are actually going off and looking to address the sources of the problems around accessibility, which often comes down to common libraries that are being used around the internet. And you say, well, what are the resources that are going into that? And it's almost nothing. There's been very little support for Drupal or WordPress or React, or it's all of the money for the industry is downstream on fixing site-specific problems. And if you do that, you're never going to catch up with the rate of change of the internet. We're always going to be 5 or 10 or 20 steps behind what was happening on the web.
Yeah, and it's always expensive. Yeah, I wasn't going to mention Gutenberg, because that's such a mess in terms of political, emotional, technology. Yeah, I mean, as to what's happened, but it is a great example of where accessibility has been forgotten, and where if they'd done it from the point where they were starting to design the new product, it wouldn't have cost them a lot. Now it's it could break the whole thing. So the the crucialness of getting this stuff considered early on to get the people that are product owners and the people that are deciding when they're going to develop new products to understand that this needs to be part of that initial process is really important, because you're right, as we bring in new technologies, what we see is we have a sort of technology sort of indicator like this, and you have a lagging indicator for accessibility. So there's always those steps behind, and it's only when we start designing it in that it becomes part of that. And that's going to require not just a change in technology, and I think there are certain things that some technologies can do to help, but it's going to change. It's going to require a change in attitude and a change in approach as well.
It's totally like a lot of it comes down to the core team behind the software project. And I was really impressed to see with the Drupal community, both in the release of Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, that the Drupal community was able to push the release date back because of accessibility problems that weren't fixed yet, and to deal with a lot of frustrations by the process of trying to go off and to address that. And that's really difficult, and to have people who are senior in other areas of leadership of the team going off and saying, we're willing to go off and invest time in this, we're willing to go off and to put the release on hold and push this project release back because accessibility is a core gate, just as important as security, just as important as performance, just as important as usability. We have to go off and consider accessibility as part of that. And again, not that it has to be perfect, but you sort of at some points have to draw the line in the sand and say, here's something that we need to do. Or if we can't do it, like an example in Drupal 8, we wanted to get the inline form editors set up so that we could have like in any forms that were being created could have good error messages if there's an error associated with that. And we got it into core, and then it started to notice that there were all of these bugs that started to happen. So we had to pull it out of core in order to go into to make sure that we were able to go off and that it wasn't destroying core functionality of the project. But the idea of going off and making accessible web forms produce error messages, like making those error messages accessible by default, it's a big challenge, and something that is not that I don't know of any other CMS out there that has made us a reasonable effort to go off and build that type of accessibility in by default, so that's just how sites are done, and we don't have that yet enabled by default, but it is part of core, and it's a core module that still needs more work, but is one that can work very well for a lot of organizations that want to be able to make sure that their error messages are as accessible as the rest of their site.
Yeah, and if we think about how important forms are, it's quite surprising how little effort has gone into the accessibility of such an important thing, because forms are the entry point to products and services and banking and all of this kind of stuff. If you can't get the form right, you can't get access to all of these core things that the internet enables. So they're the gateway. And as someone that is dyslexic, I struggle with forms. I mean, actually, web forms are better for me than paper ones. I used to be that person that would take a sheaf of forms when they were paper forms, because I know that the first 5 would end in the bin because I'd filled them out wrong. But
right.
and if with web forms, if you've got proper error handling, that that makes a huge difference for someone like me. I'm going to make a mistake. Most people will make some mistake, regardless of whether they have dyslexia or not. But I'm definitely going to make one, and please handle it gracefully. Take me to the point that I've got wrong. Tell me what I need to do. And then also tell me what I need to do in a way that's accessible to assistive technology. There's 2 or 3 elements to this that really need to happen to allow people to be successful doing this kind of thing. So
and it's something
kudos
that,
to you
that
for
almost nobody tests or looks at.
yeah. Yeah, kudos to you for getting that into core, because it's really such an important thing, and I don't think people really think, oh, it's forms, that's not pretty or whatever, but they're the key to all of these things that we rely on for the internet. Because if you don't fill in the form right, you don't get access to the product. You can't sign up to the service. You can't do all of the things that you could then do afterwards. So you can't get through the gate. That's the definition of inaccessibility.
Yeah, yeah. And it's one of these interesting things dealing with the way that Drupal is constructed. There's a forms API. So we made a lot of improvements in Drupal 7 and have continued it in Drupal 8. But there's a central place where forms are built and structure that forms are done. So because we've fixed it at the source, when people are building forms for other modules, most of the time people repeat what was done and leverage what was done in the core. Like people, there's the line that's the good developers are lazy developers, right? Because they just sort of take what's there and rebuild it, refactor it to what they need, and are not trying to go off and recreate the wheel. So if you present people with good models and provide an example for them to work on, then they're going to go off and to build from that and be able to have better products at the end of the day. So they're not necessarily thinking about how to build something accessibly. They're just, how do I follow what is the best practice of the community of software development that I'm using? And if I'm following that, then I should be okay. And that should be the case. And we've tried to go off and make sure that that's there, so that when you're adding modules or themes, that a lot of that stuff is built in, so you don't have to think. The developer doesn't have to think about it or become an accessibility specialist in order to go off and to inherit some best practices.
No, and that's it. I mean, what we really want is really rich component libraries that enable people to compile websites quickly, easily, and those components that we're sharing with people are already accessible by default, because essentially, people they shouldn't be having to think about this stuff, because the building blocks that they're using should contain that stuff. So like you say, that's taking it right back to the very beginning, because people aren't even, I love it, and people that are building products, that are building websites, they're not coding particularly. They're compiling stuff from a bunch of different components. We're not handcrafting HTML here anymore, for the most part. So
no. I mean, you can't do that, but why would you bother? Like it's you're going to use a framework of some point, whether it's a content management system or something like Bootstrap, because the web is so complicated. If you want to have a mobile-friendly website that is geared to go off and to meet all of the needs of your users, like starting from scratch and hand coding it is just, I mean, it's a wonderful learning experience, but it's a horrible waste of time. So unless you've got really highly customized needs, don't do it. I mean, this is like why when I hear people going off and building content management systems, and it's like, wow, that's a really great way to learn, but what a waste of time. Like, really, there's enough good ones out there that you shouldn't need to go off and build a new content management system, unless you're super eager to go off and learn Go or whatever else, whatever funky language is coming up that you want to go off and experiment with. But there's enough out there that you don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Good point.
And there's also just so many places. There's places where people will go off and try and reinvent the wheel, and inevitably you're going to get it wrong, because you're going to, like with both Drupal and WordPress, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of accessibility work that have gone into making those products more accessible, it's being with Drupal 7. In Drupal 7 and 8, there were at least 400 people who contributed to the accessibility issues that got into core at one point or another. And that's a lot of people. And if you're trying to go off and do this with some custom code, like, is your custom code going to be better and more accessible than the inputs from 400 other people? Like, not likely. So, try and get people to stop stop wasting their time and start trying to go off and find a good framework that they can build on that meets their needs.
Yeah.
So, just a few weeks ago, Google launched their Pixel 3, and they call it, a kind of an AI phone. Now
Right.
we have Alexa, we have so many new technology coming to market and being used in so many different ways. So if you look to technology today, what are things that are exciting you the most? And you say, oh, there's a really good potential to bring this to accessibility. We can somehow use commercial solutions and use it in accessibility as well. What are the things that are catching your eye today?
I'm definitely interested in Alexa and sort of voice control and voice interaction. The folks at Mozilla are doing some interesting work with text to speech interaction and building that right in. So I'm definitely interested in that. I do doing 360 like with virtual reality, and am interested in where virtual reality and augmented reality are going. But when I'm looking at these sort of new future technologies or present technologies, but they're not being widely adopted at this point. It's like what William Gibson said: the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. So with these new technologies, a lot of them, well, all of them basically depend on having well-structured semantic data to go off and organize them. So you need to have well-structured data in order to take advantage of artificial intelligence. And if you don't have well-structured data, then the AI isn't going to be able to make good sense of your content. And if you're wanting to go off and use Alexa, then again, you have to go off and have well-structured data so that you can collect and organize your information and make sure that you're feeding that back into your site and organize that information in a way that allows you to move ahead. So I see that accessibility is also a way to try and make sure that your content is future compatible. So whatever system you're going to want to be able to use, whatever kind of interaction you're going to want to be able to have, if you're creating and maintaining content that is accessible, you're going to be much better off. So looking at things like PDF files, like why on earth are we still using PDF files? I'm still baffled by that. I mean, other than the fact that they're useful for print purposes. So from the ability to sort of reproduce the printed page, they make sense. But they don't make sense for accessibility, and they don't make sense for mobile. And we know that most people are jumping to mobile as their primary source of information and scanning information on a regular basis. So if you're going to be excluding those people, like why would you bother? Why wouldn't you not go off and default to EPUB and have that be your primary format of a portable document, and have PDF be simply there as a backup for when you want to go off and have a format that is that you want to print out. And frankly, I don't know that many people who actually want to print out a document and read a document in a paper format. So let's try and make sure that we're doing better at producing nice, attractive portable documents in a format like EPUB that has so much of that semantic ability built into it, and that then we can start to engage with our AI to be able to say, well, let's be able to parse that information, and we know that it's well structured, so we can start making sense of that information. We don't want to go off and give our AI a whole bunch of badly structured, inaccessible PDF documents to work from, because that's not going to work well in the end. Like, the AI will not be able to learn the meaning behind that if you give it bad data.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Rubbish in, rubbish out, and that's true for every system. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And it's certainly true for AI.
And it's what people forget all the time, right?
Yeah, it's certainly true for AI, where you've got human-assisted learning as the first step of the teaching process for the AI. If you give it crap, you'll get crap out. It really is as simple as that. So yeah, we need to feed good quality information, have good frameworks for feeding that information in, and some good kind of ethical reference frameworks as well. This is a big hobby horse of mine around AI, is making sure that we're framing the questions and shaping the AI and mindful of our ethical responsibilities as we create algorithms that don't accidentally or unintentionally exclude or lead to prejudice against people. We've reached the end of our half hour. It's gone really quickly. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Mike. It's been a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to joining us on Twitter. I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting discussion. I need to thank Barclays and Mike Gifford for their continued support for AXSChat. And anyway, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Looking forward to the praying with them next week. So you'll all be online and tweeting madly. So
yes, yeah. Warm those fingers up.
That's right.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.